Okay, good afternoon, guys. Thanks so much for being here. We've already met, actually, only about 5 minutes ago, but I'm super grateful that you guys gave us your time as part of this show to share the information that you have, the experience, and the insight into what I think is a really important subject and concern and very prevalent part of the world today. I'll do a quick intro. We have Suzette Southfox here, who's a part of NAMI, which is the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I know you're the head of outreach, the outreach program manager, so you head that department. Director of Education. There you go. And one of the things that I think is really unique about NAMI, in my reading on it, is that most people involved have a personal connection to mental health, mental illness, suicide, those types of matters, sure. Which I think is great. You know, I think there's a real intrinsic motivation for people that are involved, and they're that much more connected to making a difference. And I thought that was really neat. And I look forward to hearing a lot about that and what you have to share. Sure. We also have Dr. Glenn Lipson here with us, who is a forensic psychologist. One of the things that I found fascinating about you and doing a little reading on you and your background is not just the depth of your knowledge, but also the breadth of the different types of ways that mental illness and mental health and suicide kind of, raise their head in society, whether it's with PTSD in the military or in the workplace, whether it's sexual harassment or just a number of different ways that we see it manifest. And I know you have a ton of stories to tell, and I look forward to hearing those. Real quick, I just want to share our personal story here. I run a company here in San Diego, Lawyers, Title, and Escrow, and the genesis of us being here today, which I shared earlier, this is our first show, so that's kind of exciting, is we had someone here at our company, a great guy, Joe Nunez, who was with us, and a couple years ago, he took his own life. And that hit us really, really hard. It was tough to understand because he was one of those guys that was probably, if you pick someone in the room, that was the most gregarious, funny, outgoing. Just he used to have these sayings. He was a surfer guy from Oceanside, and he'd always say, "It's all about the love, brother." And he was just always seemed so upbeat and happy and the life of the room. And so when that happened, it was a shock to all of us. And at that time, I wasn't running the company, but my partner at the time running the company, we made this commitment as a company for this to champion this cause and get information out and education and be a part of this conversation. And I think if I'm in self-reflection, being honest about it, I think over the last 2 years, we did probably what a lot of big companies do, which is show their support or their, getting behind something by writing checks or being a part of walks and those things are great, right? And golf tournaments and comedy nights and things like that. And I do believe we made a difference that way, but I think if our heart's in it, we got to do a little bit more and get the information out there. So that's why we're here today. Okay. And so I look forward to the discussion. And so maybe I'll give each of you a chance to kind of share a little bit about kind of what you do on a daily basis and your connection to the topic of mental health, mental illness, and suicide prevention, and then I'm sure that'll lead to some interesting discussion.
Sure.
So
I have a question for you.
Sure.
Tell me a little bit about how you want this to be used, and if it does what you really want it to do, what is that?
That's a great question. I'm glad you asked. So in my mind, if this touches one person, then we've won, right? So a lot of people that I've talked to in this industry, we are a for-profit company, right? It's what we do every day, and we serve customers and provide the best service we can. But at the end of the day, we, are trying to make a profit, and we're probably not known as the most community involved and charitable type of organization. But to me, if the information from this discussion, whether it's someone that's battling with depression or some kind of mental illness or is contemplating suicide, or maybe, some of the things I want to talk about is, I'm a parent of 3 kids. I'd love to learn what you guys know and what you can share about bullying and social media and those things that are just really changing the world we live in, especially for the youth. If one person that's in a bad place gets this information and knows where they can turn to get help, better understand maybe some of the things that they're feeling or thinking. Or maybe if a parent or a friend or a coworker, learns some signs or symptoms or just a way to talk to somebody that maybe they feel like is battling these things. If that affects one person and we're able to, save one life or kind of get them on the right path, I think we win.
That's awesome.
So that's my vision of this. I don't know how many people it'll reach, but at the end of the day, it's not about exposure or branding and really there's nothing in this to me that connects to like a business goal. Mm-hmm. This is truly making good on a commitment that we made to honor Joe and make a difference so that our work family never experiences something like this again or can possibly avoid it, and maybe other people out there can avoid that type of thing happening. So
thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Well, it's a pleasure to be a part of this, and I'm going to defer to you because I'm not a clinician. I'm not an expert
Sure.
in a lot of things. I am a mom. I am a peer, and I do have some experience around that. But I would love for you to start.
Usually, what you do from my chair is you make the person who is struggling with something the expert, because they're the expert on their own life. Mm. So a sign of a good expert is that they know how to listen, they know how to hear, and they know how to learn from you about your experience. And in that meeting and connecting, then there are different possibilities that become potentials that someone could decide to pursue. Suicide is often born from the sense that there's nothing to do and this pain is never going to end. And right and central to it is a sense of hopelessness, that nothing's going to change. In addition, it could be that everyone would be better off without this person. They feel like they're a burden. Now, when talking about Joe, you provided a sense of what an incredible impact he had on the life of those who knew him.
Right.
How energetic he was. How this is someone you would look forward to seeing when you came to work. That he could lighten up a room, which then makes the absence of that light all the more difficult and raising questions of what should have I asked about, what could have I seen, how could I have understood something that we never saw coming. And you're speaking to one aspect that we seldom talk about, because sometimes we make the assumption that only people who appear depressed could be suicidal.
Right.
One of the issues that occur with some people who are suicidal is the amount of pressure they feel to be a certain way. And when they don't feel they could be that person anymore, the life of the party, that ever-ready bunny with a battery going at full power and behind everything, they have a sense that they've let everyone down and they don't know how to be anyone else. And when that gets lost to them, they don't want to be here anymore. I never met Robin Williams, but I had a sense of he didn't want to live with Lewy body dementia and what he was struggling with, and that sense of loss of self. That sense of loss of self sometimes propel people to try to make a decision of whether or not they want to be here or not anymore. How do they want the world to see them? So during economic times, when there's a collapse and someone has disappointed a lot of investors and a lot of other people, you end up with what happened during the onset of the Great Depression. People jumping out of the windows in Wall Street because they can no longer be that person in terms of this sense of competency, of connection, of value. So one of the constant issues that we have in terms of working with people who are struggling with all types of issues is to have people around them that communicate a sense of value, that it's important they're here, That's one of the things organizations like NAMI help to do. And I think
Sure.
that's something you could talk a little bit about.
Sure. So NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, there's chapters all over, and San Diego is fortunate to have probably the largest one in the whole country. And we started in the late 1970s. Many of the NAMIs started then, and we were founded by parents around a table like this, a kitchen table. And the only thing that they had in common, and the only thing that they could use the table to talk about, was having an adult child who lived with schizophrenia. And at that time, certainly bad parenting was one of the reasons why people developed schizophrenia, which is not, but it was a common thought at the time. So being able to talk to peers about what was happening provided amazing support. And NAMI is known for that as well. So we do a lot of signature programs, education programs. And there are two communities, three basically, but there's the family community, the loved ones, the people who are surrounding individuals who are living with a mental health challenge, condition, crisis, what have you. It's everybody around them, and then there's the individual themselves. So we call people who live with a mental health challenge, well, we call them people, we call them peers, so people who have a mental health challenge. And then family is everybody that surrounds them. So there are specific tools, information, there's specific supports for each population. And from a family perspective, having people understand that there are options, that we can hold hope for the people that we love until they can find it themselves. But in order to get there, as a parent, as a family member, I have to understand, what is it that we're dealing with? And a lot of people think that mental health, it's a character flaw, they're not praying hard enough, it's from all different reasons, right? And it's a biological brain disorder. And that's what we teach. And we teach that there are ways to live very fulfilling lives, to figure out how that dance between medication, if that's what somebody chooses, or therapy, or a combination of those, and integrating back into, or integrating for the first time into society, right? So in order to provide that support as a family member, I have to understand what mental health is, I have to understand what mental wellness is, and I have to understand what my role is and what my role isn't. And that's really difficult for people, because it's a trauma. It's a trauma for the individual and for the people that care about them. And it's also not, and you know this really well, it's not a casserole illness, right? So when my wife had ovarian cancer, our faith community, oh man, you want your dog walked, we'll do your laundry, we'll pick up, we'll do anything for you. And it was really, really, really helpful, right? But when my son experienced his first episode of psychosis, there was nothing, absolutely nothing. And to be fair, I perhaps wasn't as forthcoming, because if you say the C word, the cancer, you've got people dancing for you. But if you say the P word, psychosis, you don't have that, and trying to figure out how to navigate that yourself. So getting families to the place, getting parents to the place to understand there is treatment, it works for most people, there's lots of possibilities, and there's hope. So we give that little bit of, that little inkling to people so they can realize, number one, they're not alone. They're not. But people don't talk about this. They're terrified to talk about this. And then you move into suicide and suicidality and people feeling that there's absolutely no hope. People get really scared. And they might have a plan, they might have the means, and they're not going to tell you. They're just not. And to make the space where it's okay to talk, where there's no judgment, where it's safe to talk, that's so important. And that's why stuff like this is great.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that's a big part of why we're doing this. I read an article where they said, when you say, hey, I have cancer, nobody says, hey, suck it up, right? But a lot of times when you have mental illness, which is a big spectrum, right? When you talk about, is it depression? Is it schizophrenia? There's so many things that fall in there, but people kind of want to look the other way. It's uncomfortable. They don't want to talk about it, which I think probably makes the peer who's suffering from it or trying to cope with it, I don't know, there's a sense of shame, right? And so usually when you're ashamed, you don't reach out and want to share that with people, right? And seek that help, which is why I think NAMI's great, because of all the people that have family that have been involved in these issues and they're so passionate about it. I think it's just a great starting point. And one of the things that you mentioned when you were talking about it was about, you said if medication is necessary, if it's not. I've kind of done some studying on this matter in preparation for this, and I was surprised how much time was spent talking about how this is such a holistic, or like you said, it's not a casserole type thing. You can't just put everyone in one bucket. And how much it's physiological, it's biological, it's chemical, it's mental, it's emotional, and there's so many different things. In your experience, how much time have you seen things change in terms of the approach, where maybe in past decades where, antidepressants came out and those were just, being given to a lot of people, is there a more holistic approach to people now that you're seeing, that maybe they're looking at diet and daily exercise? And I know there's certain probably mental illnesses, and you would know better than me that, it is absolutely, wow, no way we, have to medicate for this. But I guess, is there a different approach to it today than it has been in the past, a greater understanding of when we're diagnosing people, that we're not just saying, hey, here's some pills, it's a kind of a one size fits all?
Well, as you said, there isn't one diagnosis, and that diagnosis that someone has may be different in 30 different people. Everyone could experience depression a little differently. And we have a pendulum here in terms of treatment. And the pendulum involves whether or not someone believes there's a new miracle medication that's going to cure everyone. There was a book, Listening to Prozac, and Prozac, when it came out, was going to be the SSRI, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, that was going to cure all illness. And as you said, it is relatively complex to deal with what's going on. Not everyone responds to medication. And the solution almost never is medication. We have evidence-based studies, and medication can assist, but it's medication in the context of family, it's medication in the context of community, it's medication in the context of support from peers with or without similar struggles or diagnoses. So there's a lot of different elements. You were talking about hope. Carl Menninger, who wrote Vital Balance and a number of other books, was one of the first psychiatrists who really discuss mental illness holistically. So he's someone who would say, look, we have these diagnostic manuals that diagnose someone to a decimal point out to the 100th place. And we don't have that precision in terms of understanding what's going on, because we need to understand what that illness means to that individual. And he would say that when you go to treat mental illness, you have to start with the right measure of hope and doubt. Too much hope, you'll be unrealistic and you won't sustain your effort. Too much doubt, you won't try things. So what we encourage people to do is to find someone they could work with in mental health. And for some individuals, it may involve a number of things. You could have someone who has too much caffeine, which could be affecting anxiety, and you have to work with diet. In other cases, it may be much more biological. You also have to look at someone's history. One of the beautiful things, it isn't beautiful, but it's nice to know it started in San Diego, was something called Adverse Childhood Experiences scales that was done with Kaiser and the CDC. And what we found is what we knew already in mental health. The more bad things that happen to you while you're growing up, the more likely you're going to have problems in relationships. Some of them may be suicidal. 4 bad events, you're 2,000 times more likely to be suicidal because you lose that sense of hope more quickly. So people have to recognize their vulnerabilities based on their experience. They have to recognize the vulnerabilities based on the biology in their family, because often we'll find that there are other family members, sometimes who are undiagnosed, but suffered with some of these same types of things. And have the sort of discussions where we all admit, but by the grace of God, go any number of us based on circumstances, biology, triggering events. What are those? We need to ask. How do we build in resiliencies? So this pendulum shifts where sometimes we say, hey, medication's going to be everything, or it's going to cure it, it helps manage things, and it is part of the picture. But there are all these other elements that are involved in a successful treatment. Part of it is we know cognitive behavior therapy helps a lot. We have specific treatments now which we've never had, which have an element of treating suicide. For example, in cognitive behavior therapy for suicide, people online can now build something called a hope chest, where they put things that affirm why I want to be here that they could look at. There are apps like the Trevor Project that deals with telling someone it gets better, to basically deal with the sense that maybe I can have some hope, that it can get better. And one of the important things you heard that NAMI does is it communicates the hope to the family, but also gives them the information of people sharing which doctors in the community have treated their children in a manner where their child felt respected and ultimately found a way of managing their illness. So this communication piece becomes extremely important. If anyone tells you that the cure is this medication, this diet, this type of medication, going out into the wilderness for a period of time, like happened in the tradition of the Desert Fathers and in early Christianity, though that's not the whole story. Getting out in nature helps you. I had a client, I've had multiple clients, but when I was at the Menninger Hospital, we would occasionally go for walks because sometimes it's important to see something larger than you in scale to get some perspective, because you could get really lost in focusing on everything that's wrong and not focusing on what is inspiring, and that often occurs in nature, to get someone out of themselves a little bit. That's why we had music therapy. That's why we had art therapy. Finding ways for people to express themselves where the unspeakable can come into discussion and can lead to understanding and connection. One of the major epidemics in the world right now is loneliness. And the big problem with mental illness is it leads to loneliness. Loneliness for the families who can't talk to anyone about what's going on with their child. Loneliness for the person who's mentally ill. Loneliness, we've come to recognize, shortens life by an average of 15 years, makes the progression of Alzheimer's with cognitive decline faster. You have the same life expectancy of someone who's overweight. And loneliness is equivalent of smoking 15 cigarettes a day based on the research.
Wow.
A year ago, and the interesting thing is, you could be the life of the party like Joe, but deep down be very lonely, not really connect with people. Because they found getting you in groups doesn't cure loneliness. Before Theresa May resigned in England, one of the things she did was she recognized loneliness as such a health problem affecting 4 out of 10 people in England that she created a ministry of loneliness. In 2020, for the first time in a school system in a country, they're going to be working on addressing loneliness in both undergrades and in high school. And that hasn't occurred before. Based on the recognition of how hurt people are, and hurt people either hurt themselves or hurt other people.
Sure.
We now are developing in this country trauma-informed schools. We have a school in San Diego, Cherokee, that was copied by Leeds in England. It was listed as one of the 2 wonderful schools in trauma care. Wisconsin in 2017 became one of the first states to suggest the need for trauma-informed schools. I assisted the province of Ontario in Canada as a reviewer of a new mental health advisory that went out, because we are now struggling with suicide becoming the second leading cause of death. If you've read the CDC reports,
Between 15 and 24.
between 15 and 24, it actually goes down 13 to 34. But it is, we look at how these numbers are increasing, and they're increasing at a time when we're more digitally connected, but more alone. A recent study by Blue Cross found Austin to be one of the loneliest cities despite all the millennials that living there. The word friend in Facebook isn't the same as having a friend you could really talk to.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, and I've wondered, is it, and maybe it's a little bit of both, right? Because humans want to be connected, right? We want relationships, we want friends, we want people that we can confide in and get support from and share experiences with. And one of the things that I've wondered is, with all the social media, right, we're more connected to some degree, but really everyone's putting out there what they want people to consume. And I don't know how authentic that connection is, but I also think, and this is what I've experienced with my own kids, is there's also this constant stimulus that's happening where I think when they have any time by themselves, or they aren't connected how they see connected, whatever the definition of that is, whether it's a like or a comment or things like that, they don't even know what to do with themselves.
Yeah, connectivity is very different in different regards. That was so eloquent, talking about loneliness, because that's really, really true. And it's something that a lot of parents I talk to, not only the families themselves are experiencing, but our young people. And if you are a young person who's growing up and going through school with a mental health condition, chances are you're really just trying to get through school with a mental health condition, and maybe not socializing, maybe not building friendships, maybe not talking on the phone all night, because you're just spending all of your energy trying to get through school, right? And then you graduate. If you're lucky, you graduate, or you go back and graduate. And all of your peers are now gone. They're either away to college, or they're moving, or they're working. So now what? You don't have any connections. You don't know how to do that social thing, because I never learned it. And now I'm a young adult and I'm alone, and I'm really lonely. And I as a parent, it is devastating to have said to you, I'm so lonely, I think I'd rather just sleep, and then sleep 18 hours a day.
Wow.
It's devastating. So you do your best to try and find connections, connectivity. You do your best to try and find other communities, to try and figure out how to get that connectivity, right? And I will do one plug for social media, and also a big plug for PlayStation, because I have learned over about 2 years, so very, very briefly, my son lives with depression and anxiety, both very extreme. The anxiety is mostly separation anxiety. And we discovered, this started when he was about 9 or 10, and we got to a wonderful child psychiatrist. But when he turned 16, we realized that he's actually also on the autism spectrum. Nobody was asking the right questions, okay? So that kind of made our heads turn around, and it was like, oh, okay, now we see sort of what we're dealing with. And to try and really understand where he was. And school was very, very difficult. The last 4 months of being a senior, he spent in bed because he was too depressed to even shower, right? And then a vice principal says, hey, he's lazy. That doesn't work, right? So just trying to navigate this. I realized that I need to take a step back, stop criticizing, because of course I know what needs to be done. I really do. And just watch what he's doing. And when he said, "You want to come and watch me? Come sit down and watch me." It's like, I don't want to watch shooting people, PlayStation. This is ridiculous. And then I shut my mouth and I sat down and I watched and I watched and I watched. And I understand it now. And I see that even though he's 100% isolated, there are times when he's joking and laughing and talking to the friends that he's playing with.
Sure.
And so there is a connectivity, and it's certainly not the only thing that somebody needs to be doing, but addressing that loneliness is just, it's probably the most important thing. Really.
Right.
You said at least 5 things I could have responded to in your brief statement. I don't know where to begin, but I do want to point out that we have wrong associations between violence and mental illness. Most people who are violent are not mentally ill. And if you're mentally ill, you're more likely to be the victim of violence. And that's something to point out, because we have so many movies where they show someone who's deranged and a serial killer, or you hear this now in terms of the debate regarding what we necessarily need in terms of mental illness treatment to prevent shootings. We have people who are very isolated, lonely, and angry, and they are fodder for hate groups. They are fodder for supremacy. That's not mental illness. That is loneliness. And the problem with loneliness is we have to treat it like thirst or hunger. It's a basic need. We have something called mirror neurons that respond and help us pick up behavior from other people. We are so wired to connect. And what you said about social media is right for a lot of people, and that is you need to have time for contemplation. We've lost that because you go to a restaurant, people are always on their devices.
Exactly.
You need to have time away from the devices. So a friend of mine wrote a book called Cyber Traps for the Young, which is $9 on Amazon. I don't get a cut, but I'm just Frederick Lane. So the issue becomes one of, where do you charge your phones? Because we now know there's Facebook depression, because people are comparing these avatars, and real life doesn't live up to that.
Right.
And when you put all your energy in that false self, in that avatar, in that social media icon, it's easy to collapse when people see through it. And so one of the things we're doing in this county is we're doing a more active stepping in terms of threat assessment and looking at what's going on in the cyber world, because people post or share what they're going to do before they do bad things, or in terms of what they're thinking about. And now that space is often in social media rather than in the notes that occurred when we were much younger if someone was suicidal. Right. It's in that social media space. But the important thing is to have moments of connection with something larger than yourself, with something that helps give you perspective and gives you time for contemplation of what it means to care about others, to want their acceptance. Why do you want to be accepted, and where all that fits in? And that becomes part of mental health, is recognizing those things.
That makes a ton of sense. I mean, I think sometimes it makes me sad. It kind of breaks my heart sometimes when, some of the things that are on social media that create this expectation or this cookie cutter, whether it's image or what it means, the definition of cool. And I guess us growing up, and no matter what time frame, you're going to have peer pressure and you're going to have those things. But I just think it's so much more readily available and consumed on a mass level, mm-hmm. that I think, it's hard to get away from it. Mm-hmm. Right. There was a situation, one of my sons was at school and one of his friends was using the restroom in a stall, and someone else thought it'd be funny to reach his camera over the stall and take a picture of him. and then spread that around, right? It's just so fast and so damaging, and that kind of event can make someone, to me, I could see how that child could just go to a really bad place really fast. And he may not have had any mental illness or been depressed or anything like that, but all of a sudden that one event can have incredible damage.
It can be damaging, but it's always in the context of a life. So resiliency is based on other experiences. So never do we find something related to one event. It's their coping, their resiliency, their community, a number of other things. But we had that student whose roommate filled him surreptitiously. So we have the IoT, the Internet of Things, and people are filming, they're posting. We have what's called spoof porn, where they put your head over someone else and they show that. You have revenge porn, and we have laws, and this is relatively new. We have sexting, and we're finding kids as young as 5 or 6 year olds sending pictures of themselves that shouldn't be sent. All these are attempts at connection that have gone awry because people don't really feel loved or supported or with others, and it's their way of reaching out. So we have a lot to do with cyber citizenship, and this is a whole new frontier for us.
Sure.
As the iPhone 11 coming out, which iPhone 12, look at those years on the iPhones. They tell you how long people have had a whole production studio capability in their phone where they could share those images. So this is relatively new for society, that people could do these types of things. We're looking at elections where we know there were fake groups set up and all that type of thing. And the amount of fraud that goes on online.
Sure.
Including with titles and other types of things.
Sure.
That you're aware of.
Yeah, it's a big part of what we do all the time. So, not to, I guess, somewhat shift gears a little bit, but what, and maybe the question doesn't make sense and I'm looking at it wrong, but what percentage would you guys say of mental illness or depression in particular, that would, in the context of suicide, is kind of an ongoing thing where they've suffered from it for a long time, and what is more like event driven, if that makes sense? Does that question make sense?
No, it makes sense.
Like, a breakup, or I got fired from my job, or all those things versus if that puts a little context to it.
So if I were to talk about mass shooters, which often have a suicide component in it, FBI June of 2018 looked at 60 cases where they had enough information. I think it was like 59 or 63, somewhere in that area. I don't remember exactly. But they found on average 3.6 adverse life events that occurred before they went on that sort of mass murder rampage. And often there was a triggering event that was the final straw. So you always have to look at what's the final straw. And we have to look at what is the story that someone tells themselves. And one of the sad things about social media now is people go online and they compare other people who've done things and they want to exceed those numbers. So they'll go to Las Vegas and say over 500 people were shot. How am I going to do something larger? And how many people were shot in Pulse and all that other stuff.
Right.
But for most people, what we have to understand is that when someone ends their life, typically they're in a lot of pain, and they don't see a way out of that pain. And so the most important thing to do is to bring in that sense of hope, that things could get better, that it's okay for you to be in pain, and the issue becomes one of not getting caught in it. It's how do you let it transform? How do you let it inform you? How do you let it float away, in terms of images? At that moment, it doesn't seem possible, and you can't go on another day suffering so intensely.
So if you had, based on your experience, and throw this out to both of you, but in your experience when someone's at that point, and for those of people who are either watching or listening to this, and they had someone in their life that said, hey, I don't want to live anymore, or and I it's terrible to say lucky enough to hear that, because sometimes we don't hear it, right? And it happens like in the case of Joe. But what would be your advice in that type of situation? And maybe, dovetail into a little bit talking about Oscar and talking about care to prevent fail and some of those things that you're doing proactively to get resources and information out there. But let's start with maybe your advice to people who have someone in their life, whether it's a family member or a coworker or anybody like that is presented with this type of situation.
If they don't tell you, ask. You have to say it. You have to ask, because asking someone if they're planning on ending their life doesn't give them the idea or permission to end their life. And people are afraid to say the word suicide because they don't want to put it on the table. They're afraid to ask someone, are you considering suicide? Because that will make them. That's not true. What it will do is it will make someone feel heard. And we have to be able to ask that question. We have to be able to do that. So if somebody really has someone in their life that they're really concerned about, they need to ask them right away. And they need to get them to some kind of help. And there's different tools for doing that, certainly. There's different trainings people can get. They're all free. There's something called Question, Persuade, Refer, QPR. CPR is for the heart, QPR is for the mind, and it's to make sure that someone stays alive long enough to get to help. So there's different tools that we have, but being able to say it and being able to address it in real time. So those are two different things. Right. And to be able to address it in real time is a very powerful thing, indeed.
Thank you for that. That's
it's important to tackle that myth that if you ask about it, you're putting the idea in their head.
And I think that's why I asked. You know what I mean? I think that probably came from a place of, gosh, I wouldn't want to. Someone was really withdrawn or said the words or just seemed like really in a ton of despair. Mm-hmm. Like, gosh, but I can't ask them. Are they thinking about something like that?
Yes, and that's where the word care comes in that we're going to talk about later, just to segue into it. So basically, you have to listen with compassion. That someone's in a lot of pain if that's what they're contemplating, that they really hurt. So you have to be compassionate. You have to accept where they're at. One of the worst things you could do is argue with someone. And people will do that because they're trying to convince them not to do something. This isn't a time for polemics, to engage in a debate. This is why you should be alive. This is why. People don't want to hear that at that moment. And the reason is they feel they've disappointed people. They're not going to succeed at what they're doing. They're suffering too much. They can't go on. So rather than argue, you have to, the A in care, you have to accept that's where they're at. And when you accept that's where they're at, then you have to refer. And as a mental health person, I may have to call myself the psychiatric emergency response team. I'm doing something professionally called a lethality assessment. A lethality assessment means I'm saying, I've had people who tell me, I am going to the Swiss Alps, walk into the snow and freeze to death, but they don't have the money to buy a ticket. They're going to save up the money to go to the Swiss Alps. So they have a plan which is not very reasonable. But if someone tells me, I have a gun, it's in my car, I'm going to go blow up my brains right now, it's imminent, which is a word that we use in lethality, and I call in the cavalry. I call in the psychiatric emergency response team while they're in session. They're not, we're expanding it, but they're not available from about midnight to about 7 a.m. So there's a period of time when they're not available, but I call them up. Or, as you'll hear in a moment, I could use the Oscar app to find what's open and where to send someone. So I refer someone carefully. And then I also look to empower the part of them that has reached out to me and potentially wants to live. And I empower that by finding that small tincture or droplet of faith, that small sense that is now flickering, that's almost blown out, of maybe things could get better, and I empower that bit of hope to help someone get to the next phase where they're getting the necessary support. So at that moment, I care, I bring compassion, acceptance, I refer appropriately, and I empower the part of them that wants to live.
Thank you.
I just want to say the not arguing, I really appreciate that. And sometimes that's very hard to get to. If you have one of your children say, no one at school likes me, right? Well, what do you say? Of course people like you, right? But that's not what they're feeling. It's like, I hear you are really upset that no one at school likes you. You're having them be heard, right? So when people say those things, not to talk them out, not to argue with them, and just hear it, accept it, non-judgmentally.
And we do that as adults sometimes. We want to bring our wisdom and our experience. No, it gets better. You're so young. You have your whole life ahead of you. Think of the wonderful things you're going to get done. That doesn't matter, because you're in the here and now. And in this moment, this person is suffering, incredibly so, that they want to sleep, but they want to sleep forever.
Right. I also read something that was interesting to me and made sense, was that someone suffering from depression or is feeling that low, not to tell them everyone deals with this, or everyone, because they have this feeling of, wow, I'm not even unique. In my own despair, like I'm not even, even in my lowest, I'm not even special.
Well, you have to be careful, because we do send people to web pages. We send them to the suicide hotline, where they could text and do things, where we basically, and this is one of the things I always try to do in giving someone the right amount of hope and doubt, and that is, hope is, there are people who've dealt with this and they've made it through it. Here's some web pages, other resources that could help you. And the doubt that's present is, you're going to have to do some work, and right now, from where you're at, it doesn't look possible. So what I try to do is I try to reflect the complexity of what's going on. So it's more than just saying...
You're validating it.
I'm validating that both elements are there. So, I don't want to say, well, so-and-so was depressed and they got better. The comparisons are toxic. But what you want to say is, look, we live in a world where there are new treatment possibilities, and who knows what's going to happen down the road in terms of what we can do. I mean, every now and then, right now they're using magnets at UCSD to treat depression, and things go back and forth in terms of what are different ways to do things. We're better now at matching medications to someone's genetics.
Right.
And we're getting better at determining which medications are going to help someone. We're also modeling our medications on a molecular level on computers. It's sort of like AutoCAD for drugs, where we say, what's going to fit that 5-HT site in the brain better? How's that going to work with this individual to deal with the depletion of the neurons they need in order to feel connected and alive? So that issue of hope becomes very important, but also the doubt that we don't know if when it's going to take place, what's going to happen, and what the outcomes are going to be. Because we know with things like bipolar disorder, some individuals are going to struggle for a long, long time before they reach a point of balance and health.
Yeah, which is why I think, specifically what you shared about family and people who care about you is huge, because when I was reading up on both, Care to Prevent Fail and Oscar and stuff like that, until I sat here with you and heard it in context of that type of love and support, like it seemed to me like, God, how is this resource or an online thing, like if I'm in that place, how does that help me? What's my motivation to go there? But when you're directed, or kind of someone's holding your hand as you walk down that path, it makes a ton more sense.
So a real life example is, I was in an emergency room with an 18-year-old son that we thought was having a heart attack. in a very difficult time, trying to get back to school, and lots of things happening. Clearly not having a heart attack, but mom's terrified, and to just control our anxiety in the emergency room, we shared his earbuds because we had the app downloaded, and not only does it tell you what to do before, during, and after a psychiatric crisis, there's some like Native American flute, there's some like rainforest sounds, there's some really nice relaxing audio that just can take it down a notch.
There's like 5 of them that you could listen to.
That's awesome.
Yeah, that's built in the
really,
app.
truly.
Wow. That's so neat. So, where did that come from? I mean, what got you to that place where you guys came up with this resource? I mean, clearly, because one of the first things you said when Suzette sat down was, I love Oscar, right? So it's clearly powerful, and it's being used. It's known in the community. Like, what was the genesis of that? Where did that come from?
So it came from people who live with mental health conditions and their families. And a couple of years ago, we had a program called Tech Cafe. And what that did was it taught individuals who lived with a mental health condition how to use computers, what programs were, what a Word document was, and then gave them the computer that they learned on, right? So it was very technology based. One thing that we do know is a lot of people who live with mental health conditions do not have a lot of access to technology. So we were trying to change that. And in a lot of focus groups, we heard there was a need. There was a need for some apps to help people in these emergencies, in these crises.
That's great.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, you hear me gushing about it.
Yeah.
You find facilities that are open that you could go to, and it ties into Google Maps, so it helps navigate you there.
Wow.
So not only do you see what's open, it helps you get there. It is so well thought out.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm so proud of our NAMI chapter.
Yeah,
NAMI
it is.
chapter.
It's a flagship app program, and we've got Oscar, and then we have Oscar Jr., and these are all free. You can download them free.
Sure.
And then we have something called Alfredo, which is for IEPs. It's about how to navigate the special education system. If you're a parent and you have a young person who perhaps lives with a mental health condition or another disability, how do you get them through school? It's a very confusing process. So that was another one that we did. And these are coming out in different languages also.
And IEP is an individual education plan. So basically, they could be done at a school or at the regional center, depending on your mental illness or your disability.
Yeah, before I got into this business, I was in education. I was a teacher, and that was the path I was going down. And, I won't go down the long story of what changed the direction, but when I was first started teaching, I had the most difficult time with my first class. And a principal that I worked for, who was a mentor of mine and a very wise man, came up to me and just said, take a breath. And he said, you can't teach anything until you have your classroom managed. And they feel safe and they feel like they want to participate. And so forget about the lesson and just get them engaged. And I think that was how that ties to all of this, is that I feel like if kids don't feel safe and valued and have those types of plans and structure and what they need to feel like, wow, I'm cared about here and I belong, we could try to teach them anything under the sun, but their basic needs aren't met. So we're just kind of spinning. And what do they really care about? Algebra or, Egyptian times or the missions in California, if they're sitting there as lonely, or I don't learn this way, and yet I'm expected to learn this way.
Yeah, different ways of learning.
Yeah.
But you speak to something that's very important. And the basis of trauma-informed schools is that if you've been traumatized, you're too activated to learn. You can't listen. So what they did is, in Cherokee, they met with parents and supported them, similar to what NAMI does. They made sure there was food in the household. And suddenly, they got rid of zero tolerance. They recognize that hurt kids are going to act out. So how do we address these things? So that's the shift that's coming in education, because the majority of cases of mental illness are first seen during schooling. 70+% are seen when someone's in school. So that's why North Dakota is one of the first states to require 8 hours for its teachers and mental health training so they could better respond and recognize when people are there. Which brings me to the fail piece of Care to Prevent a Fail. So fail was for people who work in schools, because they do a lot of work there, to recognize when someone's at risk. And F was for fixation. Someone's thinking about ending their life, and they start giving things away. They start indicating that the world's going to be better without them. Something that you gave them for birthday that they know you thought was a great gift, they give back to you.
Wow.
A is the anger that's present in people who don't fit in or are alone. That's why in California, every school district needs to have a suicide prevention plan. And in that group of angry children are foster kids. Think about it. In terms of adverse life events, they've lost families, they've been in different places, sometimes they've been abused. So foster kids have those high adverse child experiences, they're high on the list. Children who've been in delinquency court and things like that, usually there's something that's going on. LGBT population, they have 4 times the amount of suicide attempts.
Right.
And right now what we're finding in this country is the greatest growth in suicide completion is in adolescent girls. And they're using a lot of ropes and they're hanging themselves. But these groups are angry. And they have reason to be angry because they're rejected, they're not accepted, they don't feel loved. That anger and being in those groups leads to that sense of loneliness and isolation. So I is that isolation that occurs with loneliness. And then finally what we assess is L. What helps them in the leap to lethality? And recognize it could be as simple as being able to drive a car, because you could drive that off a cliff. It doesn't need to be a gun or a knife. It could be pills in the medicine cabinet. So what you'll find in a lot of families that have dealt with this, they come up with systems to have doors locked or cabinets locked or medication kept in a way, just like we do in a hospital room when someone's suicidal. You have air vents if someone ties a shoelace or a rope that comes out of the ceiling so they can't hang themselves. You remove the things where someone could harm themselves through that period of time. So you look for what do they have for that leap of lethality and have they referred to it. I'm going to get a gun, I'm going to get explosives, or poison. And so you look at that. The fixation on dying, seen in what they give away and what they talk about and what they're drawing and what they're writing. A, the anger they feel, which speaks to a lack of connection, and that lack of connection is seen in isolation and loneliness. And L is the means to the leap to lethality, to death. So that's why Care to Prevent a Fail. Be compassionate, accepting, refer appropriately, and empower the part of them that wants to live. So that's what last year we trained 10,000 school employees in the county.
Wow.
As a way to approach this thing.
So what districts have those been implemented in, or have you done those trainings in?
I'm working through the San Diego County Office of Education.
Okay.
And I don't know which of the districts that belong in the risk management pool engaged in that.
Gotcha.
So
this is a shout to anyone who didn't to get on it and let's do this, right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's something we're looking at. I mean, to deal with. I was at our largest district here where they had an administrator and another person commit suicide, and we're dealing with the principals. And one of the things that struck me is how when this pebble lands in the pond of someone dying, how it touches so many lives and activates so many issues for them, similar to what happened with Joe. And the other thing I always remember, and one of the things we know, when's the greatest risk of someone committing suicide? Right when they've been released from a hospital treatment program.
Really?
And that's because they're not being watched now. They've been learned to say everything they could to get released, and they're coming back now to a life that's worse because they've been gone for weeks. They're further from their friends, and they're even more alone after that hospitalization. And everyone's blaming each other rather than connecting with each other that they ended up in the hospital. So just because you're through the crisis or someone appears to be getting better, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're through this period of time. You're in the eye of the hurricane at that moment. There's more to come as someone adjusts to living through life now with the stigma of having been rescued when they attempted suicide. They've come closer to fulfilling that, which makes the next step the next time easier.
Right.
So one of the things that NAMI has is a program called Friends in the Lobby, and that is in 9 or 10 hospitals in San Diego that have psychiatric units. And we've got family members who have had a loved one who was in the hospital previously, and they kind of learned how to deal with that, and now they're volunteering their own story.
That's amazing.
To be in the lobby, their friends in the lobby, to talk to people. So that is one way that we try and connect with families, one way we try and connect with loved ones and peers as well. And then there's 2 programs specifically for helping people that are coming out of programs, that are coming out of psychiatric programs in hospitals. One works directly with Rosecrans at County Health, Rosecrans Psychiatric Hospital, and that's called Next Steps. And we have what is in San Diego called peer support specialists or family support specialists. Those are people with lived experience who work in the field. They're using their recovery, they've gotten some education. They're not licensed, it's not clinical work, it's more mentor-like.
Sure.
So the next steps will help people with their next steps and kind of watch them as they build their life. And then Peer Links is another one for UCSD and other programs and hospitals that people come out. Again, it's walking with that individual and having that peer support. Because of that, people coming out of programs, oftentimes it's a very dangerous time. Yeah.
Wow. And those resources that you just mentioned are probably available through Oscar.
Well,
or links to them,
yeah.
or like
and our website, absolutely.
Great.
Yeah, they're listed under resources, but you connect with them directly by going to their web pages. And our district attorney's office, through Summer Stephan, and tasked to Rachel Solov, who is one of our assistant DAs, are really dealing with the need to make sure that people who are mentally ill aren't criminalized. And so they're working with the intersection of homelessness, substance abuse, and mental illness. Because often they come together. They come together because you can't hold down a job. You're depressed, so you may seek stimulants or along those lines. And that lifestyle leads to homelessness, and then it exposes you when you're mentally ill to the types of neighborhoods where you're more likely to be victimized when you're mentally ill. I had a case I did years ago where someone lost benefits, at least temporarily. We had them reinstated, where someone kidnapped someone waiting in line to get their medication and took them to a store they made them rob, and they weren't with it enough on their medication to show up to the hearing. When they were picked up, the officer said, "No, you had nothing to do with it, it's okay, but you need to go to court." Because she didn't go to court. If you're convicted of a felony, you could use your Medicare benefits. And so the issue became how some of these people are exploited and then lose their benefits that pay for their treatment. So we're trying to work on all this together because there's a tremendous problem. A lot of people who are homeless are mentally ill.
What do you think the percentage is? I mean, it's probably a tough thing to measure because they're probably not participating in a lot of, census activity and those types of things. But is there any study out there, any finding on the percentage of homeless people that are mentally ill or suffer from mental illness?
I'm not remembering the numbers, but we know that there's 500,000 people who are homeless in the United States, at least 59,000 in Los Angeles alone, and we have the numbers here. I evaluated in a lawsuit dealing with whether you could allow people who are disabled to sleep in their motorhomes because they don't want to live in shelters because they've been hurt in them, they've had their goods stolen in them, they're frightened. And every one of them I evaluated was mentally ill.
Wow.
Had suffered from either physical injuries or they lost everything. Part of what the families are dealing with is the lack of a social safety net for those who are mentally ill.
We have a clubhouse downtown. The clubhouse system in San Diego is for people who live with mental illness, and it's to connect them with social opportunities, to help them with benefits, education, housing. So there's a lot of, it's a hub of services, and they're called clubhouses, right? There's several in San Diego, and NAMI just picked up the one downtown, which is on Island, I think Broadway, Island, 16th, in that area. It's a very tough area, and it is specifically a clubhouse for individuals who are experiencing homelessness who live with a mental health condition. And we serve 40 to 50 people lunch each day, and oh my gosh, we just moved in a couple months ago, so there's a lot of people. In the county of San Diego, in terms of looking at mental health conditions and substance use disorders, the expectation is that people will have a co-occurring disorder, both. It's the expectation, not the exception.
Right. I mean, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and Veterans Village, once a year,
That's right.
John Atchison started this, has a program where they connect people with treatment and with other types of things. Because we're finding there's also a strong link between, you started the program by talking about the amount of our veterans who've committed suicide.
Yeah.
And what's going on in that community with homelessness and substance abuse. We now have veterans courts dealing with what is the impact emotionally and psychologically of having been in war and multiple tours of duty.
Right. So, I mean, definitely one of the things that I've gathered from this conversation is that it's not an individual sport, so to say. You know, it takes a village to make an impact, to take care of these people, to help people that we love. So for those people that are kind of on this journey with them, whether it be, you know, and you have firsthand experience with your son, what would be your advice to a family member? So not just the peer dealing with the particular issue and what they're going through and specifically how to help them, but in terms of self-care for some of the people who are parents or brothers and sisters or coworkers or that kind of stuff, you know, what would be your advice to those people who clearly have to practice patience and love and understanding and all that stuff?
You should do a show on self-care. You should. And self-care shaming is something that we don't want to happen, and that's when you're trying to get someone to take care of themselves to such an extent that you're shaming them because they're not doing it the way you think they should.
Right.
And that, excuse me, that's devastating.
Right.
As someone who does not do self-care very well, I'm very, very well acquainted with that. But the message that I would give is watch your language, how you talk. That's really, really important. Understand that you're absolutely not alone. There's a lot of people dealing with this, an awful lot of people. There's free resources. You just have to reach out for it, and you have to give it a chance. And oftentimes the people that really need to be in the class or the group, the people that really need it, they're the ones that can't stand classes and groups, right?
Right.
So just be patient. There's a lot of people, there's a lot of help out there.
And I would imagine a lot of people, because of how the societal pressures have, you know, treated mental illness, and we talked about the shame or, you know, keeping it quiet, that there's probably a lot of people don't take the time for, because it's no, I'm here to help my son. I'm here to help my brother. I'm here. No, this is for them. And, you know, it probably is sometimes difficult for people to grab a hold of the resources that are available to take care of themselves, to probably make them more able to better take care of those other people.
It's a tremendous pressure, and the trauma that you're experiencing, it's almost like I think people default to their worst their worst things about caring for themselves because they're just spinning, trying to cope, trying to deal. They don't know what's going
Right.
on. They don't stop long enough to reflect, take a breath, and realize, okay, I'm on this train. I got to figure out what's the car in front of me, what's the car behind me, and to realize that there are other people on the train that can really help them.
Right.
Yeah.
And at the same time, you have to be your child's advocate. So although there are people on the train who could help, they don't make it on the train unless you help get them on the train. So it's challenging. In law enforcement, we can't call it burnout, we call it compassion fatigue. So there are measures that we use in terms of irritability and all these other signs that someone could look at that they're getting fatigued. And you need to have those breaks, as you're suggesting for self-care. And ultimately, if we want to judge the society that we create, and Gandhi and Toynbee, the historian, a number have said the same thing, that we could judge how wonderful our society is by how it treats its mentally ill, its criminals, its elderly, and its children.
That's pretty impactful right there. So maybe that's a good place for us to leave off.
Sure.
I think we've had a really good discussion. Again, thank you so much for being here for our first show, and something that's near and dear to our heart here. Something important to me and our family here at the company. And I know you've taken time out of your day to contribute. And I wish you both extremely well. I have so much respect for people who make it part of their mission to really take care of other people and affect the world. And I think each of you are doing that. And I think that's really great. So
not only are you welcome, I want to thank you for having the courage to have this type of conversation. It is really admirable and appreciated.
thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, guys.
Okay.